He didn't look up when the door opened. That was the thing about Edmund Crowe. He never looked up. Not when his hired men dragged a woman across the floor of his office. Not when her 7-year-old boy screamed and grabbed at her arm. Not when the child's fingers left streak marks in the dust on the floorboards because nobody had thought to clean them. Edmund kept his eyes on the papers in front of him. Land deeds, survey records, numbers that represented families, their barns, their wells, their graves. He turned one page over slowly, the way a man turns a page in a Bible. Deliberate, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world, because he did. "Get the boy out of here," he said. Not loudly. He didn't need to be loud. One of the men grabbed Noah by the collar. Evelyn Mercer made a sound that wasn't quite a word, something raw and animal that a mother makes when someone touches her child. She reached for him, and the second a man caught her wrist and bent it sideways until she went still. Edmund finally looked up. "Where are the documents, Mrs. Mercer?" She didn't answer. He nodded, like her silence confirmed something he already knew. "Take the boy to the barn," he said. "She'll talk before supper." If you've ever watched someone treat another human being like they were nothing, like their pain was just an inconvenience on the way to something more important, then you already know exactly what kind of man Edmund Crowe was. And if you've ever asked yourself what you would do in that moment, whether you'd look away or whether something in you would finally refuse to stay quiet, that's what this story is about. Before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to you, if you believe that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when it matters most, please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. I read every single one. Now let's go back to where it all began. Not with Edmund Crowe, and not with Evelyn Mercer. Let's go back to a man eating alone. The bread on Silas Boone's plate had gone cold an hour ago. He hadn't noticed. He'd stopped noticing things like that a long time back. The temperature of food, the noise of a room, the way afternoon light came sideways through dirty glass. He sat at the far end of the bar in a saloon called the Dusty Fork, which was neither particularly dusty nor shaped like a fork, and he ate the same meal he always ate when he came down from the mountain every 2 weeks to resupply. Salt pork, boiled potato, 1 piece of bread, 1 glass of something brown that the barman called whiskey and that Silas had long since stopped tasting. He was 37 years old and looked closer to 50, not because life had been cruel to him exactly, more because he'd stopped fighting back against the parts that were. After Margaret died, after both of them died, Margaret and little Clara, the fever taking them both in the same terrible week 3 years ago, Silas had walked up into the mountains and built a cabin and stayed there. He still worked. He was a surveyor, good at it, and there was always someone who needed land measured and mapped. He came down when he had to. He went back up when he could. That was the whole of his life, and he'd made a kind of peace with it, the way you make peace with a sore tooth. You stop poking at it, and eventually you almost forget it's there. He was poking at the cold potato when the door opened. He didn't look up either, at first. He heard the door, heard the change in the room, a small hesitation in the noise, the way a crowd goes slightly quiet when something unexpected walks in. He kept his eyes on his plate. Then he heard the boy. Not crying. That's what caught him. A crying child he could have ignored, same way you ignore rain against a window. It's just weather. But this child wasn't crying. This child made one single sound, something between a gasp and a grunt. The sound a person makes when they've been walking for a very long time and they've finally stopped and their body doesn't quite believe it yet. Then silence. Silas looked up. She was standing just inside the door holding the boy's hand with both of hers, her left wrapped around his, her right crossed over the top, like she was afraid he might float away. She was young, maybe 28 or 30, with dark hair coming loose from a braid and a coat that had seen better decades. The boy was small for 7, thin in a way that went past skinny into something that made the back of your throat tighten. He had her same dark eyes. He was scanning the room the way children scan a room when they've learned that rooms can be dangerous. Quick, careful, head slightly down. The woman looked at nothing in particular. She didn't look for help. Silas noticed that. She wasn't scanning for a kind face. She was just standing still, like she needed 30 seconds before she could figure out what the next step was. The barman, a wide man named Gerald, who had the personality of a fence post, looked up from the glass he was wiping. "You need something?" "A meal," she said, "for my son." "You got money?" The pause that followed was about 1 second long. 1 second is not very long unless you're the person who pauses and knows exactly what that pause means, and knows that everyone in the room can hear it. "I have," she started. "Prices are on the board," Gerald said, already looking back down at his glass. She looked at the board. Silas watched her look at it, watched her do the math in her head, watched something in her face settle, not fall. Settle, the way a person settles when they've already been through worse than this, and they've learned that embarrassment is just a feeling and feelings don't kill you. She walked toward the bar. She walked past 3 empty tables. She didn't sit down at any of them. She walked to the bar, and she stopped 2 stools down from Silas Boone, and she looked at the plate in front of him, the untouched bread specifically, and she looked at him. "Excuse me," she said. He looked at her. "My son hasn't eaten since yesterday morning." She said it the same way you'd say the weather's been dry lately. Not ashamed of it, not performing for sympathy, just stating a fact that was relevant to what she was about to ask. "That bread on your plate, if you're not going to finish it, may he have it?" Silas looked at the bread, looked back at her. Then he looked at the boy, who was standing very still beside her and looking at nothing, doing that thing children do when they're trying hard not to want something. Something happened in Silas's chest. He couldn't have named it. It wasn't pity exactly. Pity is soft. This was something harder, something that hurt a little, the way a muscle hurts when you've been holding it tight for too long and someone finally tells you to let go. He pushed the whole plate toward the boy. "He can have all of it," Silas said. The woman blinked. "Just want once." "That's too much. I only meant—" "I know what you meant." He stood up and turned to Gerald. "Get them both a proper meal. I'll cover it." Gerald looked at the woman, looked at Silas. "You know her?" "No," Silas said. "Does that matter?" Gerald thought about it longer than the question deserved, then went into the back without further comment. The woman was still looking at Silas. Not with gratitude exactly, or not only with that. There was something cautious in it, like she was trying to figure out what this was going to cost her. He understood that look. He'd seen it on Margaret's face the first time he'd offered to help her carry something, years ago in another life. The calculation. What does he want? What does anyone want? "Thank you," she said finally. "We won't be any trouble." "Wasn't worried about it," he said. He sat back down. Meant to finish the conversation there. Meant to go back to his potato and his brown whiskey and his careful, hollow quiet. He'd done a decent thing. That was enough. That was more than he'd done for anyone in 3 years, if he was being honest. But the boy sat down 2 stools over and picked up that piece of bread with both hands and ate it in 4 bites without breathing, and Silas found he could not look away. The meal Gerald brought wasn't much. Stew mostly, heavy on the broth, light on the actual substance. The kind of meal that filled the belly without doing a great deal else. But the boy ate it like it was the finest thing he'd ever tasted, bent over the bowl with his spoon moving fast and steady. And the woman ate more slowly, watching him, only starting on her own bowl after she was sure his was going to be enough. Silas watched them from the corner of his eye. He wasn't trying to. It happened the way breathing happens. He noticed things. He noticed that the boy's left sleeve was torn and had been re-sewn badly, with thread that didn't quite match. He noticed that the woman's boots were caked with dried mud that went halfway up the heel. Not road mud, mountain mud, the heavy red clay kind that meant she'd been off the main trails. He noticed that she sat with her back to the wall, even at the bar, positioned so she could see both the front door and the door to the kitchen. He noticed she'd checked the front door 3 times since sitting down. He was a surveyor. It was his job to notice things other people missed. The woman caught him looking. He expected her to look away. Instead, she met his eyes directly and said, "We're passing through." "All right," he said. "We're not going to be a problem for anyone." "I didn't think you were." She held his gaze for another moment, like she was waiting for the catch, for the part where he told her what he actually wanted. When it didn't come, she looked back at her bowl. "My name is Evelyn," she said. "This is Noah." The boy looked up briefly from his stew. He had a small scar above his left eyebrow, pale and old. "Thank you for the bread, sir," he said, with the formal politeness of a child who'd been carefully taught his manners, even while everything else came apart. Something in Silas's chest did that thing again, the hurt thing. "Silas," he said, "and you're welcome." They sat without speaking for a few minutes. The saloon moved around them, men playing cards in the back, someone arguing about a horse outside, Gerald polishing the same glass he'd been polishing since Silas arrived. "Where are you headed?" Silas asked. He didn't know why he asked it. He wasn't in the habit of asking people things. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Not the pause of someone who doesn't know, but the pause of someone deciding how much to say. "Denver," she said. He nodded. "That's 3 days from here, 4 if the weather doesn't hold." "I know." "You have transport?" Another pause. "We'll manage." He looked at her coat, at the mud on her boots, at the way the boy's ribs had been visible, briefly, when his shirt shifted as he leaned forward over the bowl. Silas thought about saying something else, thought about it seriously, turned it over in his head, felt the old familiar warning signal. "Don't get involved, Silas. You tried that once. You know how it ends. Some things can't be fixed, and getting close just means you're there when they break." He heard the front door open. He didn't look up immediately, neither did Evelyn, but he felt her go still. Not the stillness of someone who doesn't notice, the stillness of someone who has learned to make themselves invisible at very short notice. He heard Noah's spoon stop moving. The 2 men who walked in were not the kind of men who came into a saloon looking for a drink. Silas had been in enough saloons in enough dangerous years of his life to know the difference. These men came in looking. One went left along the wall. The other came straight to the bar, slowly, scanning faces. Silas kept his eyes on his glass. In his peripheral vision, he saw Evelyn lean down very slightly and touch the boy's arm once. One small, deliberate touch, the kind of signal that's been agreed on in advance. Noah did not look up, did not move, became very small. The man at the bar stood 3 stools away and said to Gerald, "You see a woman come in here? Dark hair, traveling with a boy?" Gerald opened his mouth. Silas said, without looking up, in the flat, bored tone of a man who'd been asked a stupid question, "Sounds like half the women in the territory. You got a name?" The man turned to look at him. "Mind your business, friend." "I'd be happy to," Silas said, "soon as you stop shouting in it." It was the wrong thing to say, and the right thing to say. It drew the man's attention completely onto Silas, which meant it was off Evelyn. The man held his gaze, the measuring kind of stare that men use when they're deciding whether something is worth the trouble. Silas stared back. He had 37 years of not caring what happened to him. That shows on a face. The man looked at him for 5 full seconds and then made a decision, not worth it, and turned back to Gerald, who was now polishing his glass with intense concentration and saying nothing. The 2 men did a slow circuit of the room. They stopped. They said something to each other too low to hear, then they went back out the front door. The room breathed again. Silas didn't move. Neither did Evelyn. They sat for 30 seconds in silence, both of them knowing that moving too fast after something like that is how you make a mistake. Then she said very quietly, without turning her head, "They'll be back." "I know," he said. "We need to leave." "I know that too." He put money on the bar for Gerald, extra money, the kind that means this conversation never happened. And he stood up and picked up his hat and said to Evelyn, without looking at her directly, "There's an alley out the kitchen. Comes out behind the feed store. My horse is at the post on the left side. I'll be there in 2 minutes. You don't have to follow me." He walked toward the kitchen without waiting for her answer. He didn't know if she'd follow. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself he was just pointing out an option, same as you'd tell a stranger their coat was on a hook nearby. Just information, freely given, no obligation attached. He got to the back door and pushed it open into the alley, and stood there for a moment in the cold air, listening to the sound of the street, the wind, the distant argument about the horse. He waited 2 minutes. Then he heard the kitchen door open behind him, and a small set of footsteps, and a larger set of footsteps, and a child's voice say very quietly, "Is the man coming with us, Mama?" And Evelyn Mercer's voice, equally quiet, said, "I don't know yet, baby." Silas turned around. She was looking at him with those careful, measuring eyes. Noah was holding her hand with both of his again, the same way she'd held his when they came through the door. Silas looked at them for a long moment, thought about the cabin, thought about the quiet, thought about 3 years of silence that had been starting to feel not peaceful, but deadening, like slowly going numb in cold water. My cabin's 12 miles up the North Ridge, he said. Nobody knows that trail but me. You'll be safe there tonight. She searched his face. And tomorrow? Let's get to tonight first, he said. He turned and walked toward his horse, and after a moment he heard two sets of footsteps follow him, and something in his chest that had been cold for a very long time did not exactly warm. But it moved. And sometimes that's how it starts. Not with a decision, not with a plan, not with anything large or deliberate at all. Sometimes it starts with a piece of cold bread pushed across a bar, and two sets of footsteps behind you in an alley, and the particular way a 7-year-old boy does not cry when he is afraid, which is the bravest thing you have ever seen. Silas Boone hadn't been brave in 3 years. He wasn't sure he remembered how, but he remembered what it felt like to be followed by someone who needed him to be. And he kept walking. The North Ridge Trail was not a trail so much as a suggestion. Silas knew it by memory more than by sight. A series of landmarks that only made sense if you'd walked them enough times that your feet remembered before your eyes did. The bent pine at the first fork. The dry creek bed that looked like a path but wasn't. The cluster of granite boulders where you turned left, and then immediately right, a direction that felt wrong until you'd done it a dozen times. He'd surveyed this entire section of mountain 3 years ago, right after Margaret died, partly because someone paid him to, and partly because walking with a measuring chain gave his hand something to do while the rest of him came apart. Evelyn rode behind him on the horse, his horse, a gray mare named nothing in particular because Silas had never gotten around to it, with Noah sitting in front of her, the boy's back pressed against her chest, her arms around him holding the saddle horn. Silas walked. The horse could carry 2 but not 3, and he knew this ground well enough to walk it blind if he had to. Nobody spoke for the first hour. That was fine with Silas. He wasn't a man who needed to fill silence, and apparently neither was she. What wasn't fine was the feeling in the back of his neck, the kind that came from years of working remote land where knowing when something was wrong could be the difference between going home and not. He'd had it since the alley. It hadn't faded. If anything, now that they were out of the saloon and on the open trail, well, as open as a mountain forest got, it had gotten sharper. Twice he'd stopped and listened. Twice he'd heard nothing except wind and the horse breathing. But nothing is not the same as nothing is there. He stopped a third time at the halfway point, at the granite boulders, and held up one hand. The horse stopped. Evelyn said nothing. Noah said nothing. Silas stood still and listened for 45 seconds. The wind was moving east. He turned east and listened harder. Far down the slope, maybe 1.5 miles, maybe 2, he heard something that might have been a branch breaking under weight or might have been a deer. He waited. Heard it again. Same interval. Deer don't move at the same interval. We need to go faster, he said. I heard it too, Evelyn said. He looked up at her. How long have you been listening for things like that? Long enough, she said. He didn't ask what that meant. Not yet. They moved faster. The mare picked her way through the dark stretch below the tree line where the ground was uneven and the light was poor, and Silas pushed the pace harder than he was comfortable with, because being comfortable was less important right now than being gone. By the time the cabin came into view, low against the ridge, built into the hillside in a way that made it nearly invisible from below, his legs were burning and he was breathing hard, and he didn't care about either. He got the horse into the small lean-to he used as a shelter, and Evelyn and the boy came inside, and he closed the cabin door and stood with his back against it for a moment in the dark. Don't light anything yet, he said. I wasn't going to, she said. He stood there for 5 minutes listening to the mountain. What he heard was ordinary. Wind. One owl somewhere to the south. The settling noises a structure makes when the temperature drops. No horses. No voices. No branch breaking at regular intervals. He let himself breathe normally again, or close to it. All right, he said. Small fire. Keep it low. The cabin was one room. Silas had built it that way on purpose. One room was easier to heat, easier to check, easier to leave in a hurry. There was a cot against the left wall, a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf with the practical things a man alone needs and not much else. No pictures. He'd taken the pictures down the first month. It was easier. Noah stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly in a circle, looking at everything with the particular curiosity of a child who has spent a lot of time in places that were not safe and recognizes, Maybe for the first time in a while, a place that might be. You live here by yourself? The boy asked. Yes, Silas said. Doesn't it get lonely? Silas glanced at him. The boy was asking it straight, no cruelty in it, just the honest question of someone for whom loneliness was a concept worth taking seriously. Sometimes, Silas said. It was the most honest answer he'd given anyone in years. Evelyn had been quiet since they came in. Now she sat down at the table with both hands flat in front of her and said, I owe you an explanation. You don't owe me anything. Those men in the saloon will keep looking, she said. If you're going to be anywhere near us, you need to know why. He sat down in the other chair. Outside, the wind picked up and then settled. All right, he said. She looked at her hands for a moment. Not collecting herself. She was already collected. He could see that. She'd told this story to herself enough times that the telling of it wasn't going to break her. She was just deciding where to start. Edmund Crow, she said. He knew the name. Most people in the territory knew the name. Edmund Crow owned more land than some counties, operated mining operations and cattle operations and a dozen other things, had lawyers in Denver and political connections in places that mattered. He was not the kind of man whose name came up in polite conversation without a specific, careful tone attached to it. He was my husband's employer, Evelyn said, before Thomas died. Thomas worked as a land agent for Edmund's operation, inspecting properties, verifying titles, handling the paperwork when Edmund acquired new parcels. Thomas was good at it, too good maybe. She paused. He started noticing things that didn't add up, survey records that had been altered, signatures on documents that didn't match, witnesses to land transfers who, when Thomas tried to contact them, didn't seem to exist. Forgeries, Silas said, systematic ones. Edmund has been stealing land from settlers for at least 6 years, not stealing it outright, doing it through paperwork. He'd find a family with a weak title, usually immigrants who didn't fully understand how the recording system worked, and he'd have someone file amended documents with the county clerk. Small changes. A property boundary moved 50 feet. A lien that wasn't there before. An ownership dispute that conveniently settled in Edmund's favor before the original owner understood what was happening. She looked up at Silas. Families lost everything. Farms their parents built. Land they'd broken their backs on for 20 years. And Edmund paid the right people enough that nobody asked questions. Silas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and Thomas found proof. Thomas found enough to start building proof. He spent 8 months gathering it. Original deeds, copies of the altered records, sworn statements from 3 families who were willing to testify. Her jaw tightened. And then Thomas died. How? Riding accident, that's what it was ruled. His horse went off a trail he'd ridden 100 times in all conditions. She said it flatly. Not because she didn't feel it, because she'd processed this particular grief into something harder and more useful. He left me the documents, hidden in a place Edmund's men didn't find when they came to search the house 3 days after the funeral. He told me where they were in a letter I found with our marriage papers. Silas looked at her. You've been carrying them since then. 7 months, she said. We've moved 4 times. The last place, they found us inside of 2 weeks. I don't know how. She glanced at Noah, who had climbed onto the cot and was sitting with his back against the wall, listening with the careful quiet of a child who'd learned that adults' conversations were important and he should pay attention. I need to get to Denver. There's a federal attorney there, Jonathan Hale. Thomas knew him, trusted him. These documents need to get to him directly, not through county channels, because Edmund owns enough county officials that anything filed locally disappears. Silas processed this. The fire had caught and was giving off enough light to see by. He studied her face, not looking for something specific, just reading it the way he read terrain, looking for what was solid and what wasn't. What he saw was solid. How many men does he have looking for you? He asked. At least 6 that I know of, probably more. She paused. And one that worries me more than all the others. Who? Victor Sloan. Silas was quiet for just a beat longer than he should have been, and she noticed. You know him, she said. I know of him. Enough. Victor Sloan was a tracker by trade and reputation, the kind of man that other hard men in the territory spoke about with a specific careful respect. Not a killer for hire exactly, something more specialized than that. He found things. He found people. He found them in places other trackers gave up on, through methods he didn't explain and that people who hired him didn't ask about. It was said he'd never lost a trail once he picked it up. Silas had no reason to think that was false. "He's been behind us since Three Forks," Evelyn said. "We got ahead of him when I took Noah off the main road and cut through the ridgeland east of Heller's Creek. But we lost our horse in the crossing." That explained the mud on her boots. The mud went up higher than road mud. She'd walked through a creek crossing in wet clay, pulling the boy, after losing their horse. For how long, Silas didn't know, but long enough to reach the dusty fork on foot, with nothing left for food, still moving. He thought about what that took. Not just physically. The kind of will it required to keep going when every reasonable option had run out, and there was nothing left but the next step and then the step after that. He thought about the way she'd asked for the bread. Not begging, not performing, just stating a fact and making a request. Like someone who'd decided that pride was a luxury she didn't have room for, but dignity was something she was keeping regardless. "Get some sleep," he said. "Both of you. We'll talk more in the morning." She looked at him. "You're not going to ask me to leave?" "No." "Why not?" It was a fair question. He thought about it for a moment, genuinely. "Because those men were in that saloon looking for you," he said. "That means they're in this area. Which means my staying uninvolved isn't actually an option anymore, regardless of what I do tonight." He paused. "And because your boy thanked me for a piece of bread like I'd handed him something precious, and I can't quite make myself forget that." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Silas." "Don't," he said. "Not yet." He didn't sleep. That wasn't unusual. He hadn't slept well in 3 years. But tonight it wasn't grief keeping him awake. It was his brain working through the shape of the problem, the way it worked through a survey, methodically, from the edges inward. Evelyn's situation was worse than she might be fully letting on, not because she was hiding things, but because she'd been living inside it so long that certain things had stopped registering as extraordinary. 6 men, she said, plus Sloan. That was a serious deployment of resources for one woman with a packet of documents, which meant the documents were serious. Serious enough that Edmund Crowe was spending real money and real exposure to recover them, which meant he was more afraid of them than of the attention that searching for them attracted. That told Silas something. It told him the documents weren't just evidence of wrongdoing. They were potentially catastrophic for someone beyond Edmund. If the forgeries implicated county officials, federal surveyors, judges, if this thing went high enough, then the people involved couldn't afford for Evelyn to reach Jonathan Hale. The second thing that was bothering him was Victor Sloan. Sloan didn't operate on guess. He operated on information. Evelyn said she didn't know how they'd been found at the last location inside 2 weeks. That kind of speed didn't come from tracking alone. That came from someone who already had a general idea of her direction and was filling in the specifics. Someone was feeding Sloan information about her planned route, or her contacts, or both, which meant that anyone Evelyn went to for help was potentially already on Sloan's map. Including, now, Silas. He sat with that for a while. In the gray pre-dawn quiet of the cabin, with the fire burned down to coals, and Evelyn and Noah both asleep on the cot. She'd tried to give it to Noah and end up on the floor, but the boy had refused with a stubbornness that told you exactly how his mother had raised him, and they'd both ended up wedged onto it together. Silas sat in the chair by the table and thought about what it meant to be on Sloan's map. It meant that staying here was not actually safe. Not for them. The cabin was well hidden, but Sloan would find it eventually. A man like that, with enough time and the right information, found everything eventually. It meant that if Silas was going to do this, and he'd already decided he was going to do this, sometime between the alley and now, though he couldn't have pointed to the exact moment, he needed to stop thinking about hiding and start thinking about moving. The only way to beat Sloan was to not be where Sloan expected you to be. He got up quietly and went to the shelf where he kept his survey maps. He spread the one covering the route between here and Denver across the table and looked at it in the dim firelight. The obvious routes were obvious. Sloan would have them covered or would cover them soon. The main road was out. The Eastern Pass was out. Too exposed. Too few alternatives if you ran into trouble. The route through Miller's Crossing was faster but passed through 3 towns, any one of which might have Crow's people stationed. Silas moved his finger across the map, tracing lines that weren't roads. He knew this territory the way most men knew their own house. Not perfectly, not every corner, but well enough to move through it in the dark without running into walls. He'd surveyed nearly 800 square miles of it over 12 years. He knew the freight routes that weren't on official maps. He knew which mountain passages were passable in early fall and which ones a horse couldn't manage. He knew the homesteaders who would feed you and ask no questions in exchange for not being asked any, and he knew the ones who'd report you to the nearest authority for the price of a good word. He began to plan a route. It was complicated. It would take longer than the direct path. It would require things he'd need to arrange, some of it on very short notice. He had a contact in Walden who ran freight wagons east twice a month. He had another contact, a retired surveyor named Pete Crabb, half-deaf, deeply indifferent to other people's business, who had a farm at the base of the eastern ridge, where a person could spend 2 days without being noticed. He was still working through it when he heard Evelyn's voice behind him, quiet, so as not to wake Noah. "You've been up all night." He hadn't heard her get up. That bothered him slightly. He was usually more aware. "Yes." She came to stand beside the table and looked at the map. She didn't ask what it was. She looked at it for a moment, orienting herself, then put her finger on the territory above Miller's Crossing. "There's a pass here," she said. "Thomas showed it to me on a map years ago. He said surveyors used it in the early days, but it wasn't on most official charts." Silas looked at where her finger was. "Morrison Gap," he said. "I know it." "Is it passable?" "This time of year, barely. It'll be cold at the top and the trail on the north face is narrow." He paused. "But nobody uses it and nobody watches it. I'll give you that." She looked at the map for another moment. Then she said, "Silas, I need you to understand something before you go any further with whatever you're planning." He waited. "The people looking for us are not going to stop because you're in the way," she said. "They'll go through you. Edmund has done it before. Thomas wasn't the first person who gathered evidence and then had a convenient accident. And Sloan," she stopped, something crossing her face that she quickly controlled. "Sloan isn't a man who leaves loose ends. If he decides you're in his way, being uninvolved in the original matter won't protect you." "I understand that," Silas said. "I'm not sure you do," she said. And it wasn't an insult, it was just her being precise. "I'm not asking you to walk away. I've got nowhere else to turn and I know it. I'm just making sure you know what you're choosing." He looked at her. She was still in the clothes she'd slept in, hair loose now, dark circles under her eyes from weeks of bad sleep and worse circumstances. She was scared. He could see that. She wasn't hiding it entirely. But the fear was something she'd put in a specific compartment and was managing, not something that was managing her. "My wife's name was Margaret," he said. "My daughter was Clara. They died 3 years ago, the both of them, inside the same week. Fever." He said it the way you say something you've said to yourself 10,000 times. Not without weight, but without the ragged edge of something new. "After that I came up here and I stopped caring a great deal about what happened to me." She was listening, not performing sympathy, just listening. "The thing is," he said, "not caring what happens to you turns out to be a problem when you've got someone else to worry about. Because then you start caring again whether you want to or not." He looked at the map. "I know what I'm choosing." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry about your family." "Thank you," he said. Simple, no elaboration. They stood at the table together looking at the map, and after a moment she said, "Show me the route you're thinking." He showed her. She asked good questions, specific ones, about timing and terrain and contingencies if a particular segment went wrong. He answered them straight, and she listened to the answers straight, and somewhere in the middle of the second hour of that conversation, Silas registered that this was the longest he'd talked to anyone in 3 years, and that it felt less strange than he would have expected. Outside, the light was beginning to change. Not bright yet. Dawn in the mountains takes its time, but the quality of the dark was shifting, going from solid to merely deep. Noah's voice came from the cot, small and sleep-rough. "Mama?" "I'm here, baby," she said. "Go back to sleep." A pause. "Is the man still here?" Silas looked at the cot. The boy was looking at him over the blanket with one eye. "Yes," Silas said. Noah appeared to think about this. Then he said, "Good," and pulled the blanket back over his head. Evelyn looked at Silas. Something in her face shifted almost imperceptibly. Not quite a smile, but what a smile comes from before it becomes one. He looked back at the map. We leave at first light, he said. 2 days to Pete Crab's farm. From there we pick up the freight wagon east and cut north to Morrison Gap before Sloan can get ahead of us. He traced the route with one finger. It's going to be uncomfortable. Everything has been uncomfortable for 7 months, she said. Uncomfortable I can manage. He folded the map and put it in his coat pocket and started banking what was left of the fire. They had maybe 40 minutes before they needed to move. 40 minutes to pack what they could carry, which wasn't much, and get back on the trail before the light got good enough for someone with Sloan's skills to use. He was pulling on his second boot when Evelyn said, from across the room, "Silas." He looked up. "You asked me last night if I heard things in the dark," she said. "I've been doing it since we left our house in March. 7 months of listening for footsteps and watching strangers' faces and running." She paused. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to be in a room with someone and not be afraid of them." He didn't have an answer to that was worth saying out loud. So he just nodded once and went back to his boot. But he felt it again, that thing in his chest. Not the hurt this time, something adjacent to it. Something that moved in the direction of being alive. He laced the boot tight and stood up and said, "Let's go." The first day out of the cabin, nobody followed them. That was the part that bothered Silas most. Not being followed felt like good luck. And good luck in his experience was usually just bad luck that hadn't introduced itself yet. He kept them off the main deer path and moving through the thicker timber on the west face of the ridge, where the ground was harder and left less sign, and where the trees were dense enough that a man on horseback would have serious trouble moving fast. It slowed them down too. That was the trade. He'd made worse ones. Evelyn didn't complain about the pace or the terrain. Noah didn't either, though by midday the boy was flagging badly. His legs were shorter than theirs, and what was a moderate stride for Silas was nearly a trot for him. Silas noticed without saying anything and started timing their rest stops differently, finding reasons to pause and check direction or read the sky that happened to coincide with the moments when Noah's breathing got ragged. The boy never asked to stop. That kind of pride in a 7-year-old is either admirable or heartbreaking depending on how you look at it. Silas found it both. Around midday, they stopped at a rock outcropping that gave a view down the eastern slope. Silas scanned the tree line below for movement, while Evelyn divided what food they had. Hard biscuits from the cabin, a piece of salt pork wrapped in cloth, some dried apple that had been on his shelf for longer than he cared to think about. She gave Noah the larger portion without discussion. He took it without discussion. They'd worked out their respective roles in the world without anybody having to explain it. "Tell me about Pete Crab," she said, not looking up from the food. "Old surveyor. Came out here about 15 years ago from somewhere in Pennsylvania, I think. Bought a piece of land at the base of the ridge, built a house, planted things. Half of what he plants dies. He doesn't seem to care much." Silas paused. "He's mostly deaf in one ear and partially in the other. You have to speak up and look at him directly. He reads lips some." "Does he ask questions?" He once let 3 men stay in his barn for a week without asking a single thing about them. Later turned out they were wanted in 2 territories. Silas watched the tree line. Nothing moved wrong. "He made them fix his fence before they left, though." Evelyn almost smiled. "He sounds manageable." "He's good people," Silas said, and meant it simply. There aren't as many of those as there should be. Noah had finished eating and was sitting on a flat rock with his knees pulled up, looking down at the valley below. Something about his posture, the way he sat with his chin on his knees, still but watchful, reminded Silas so sharply of something he couldn't quite name that it hit him in the sternum like a physical thing. He looked away. "Silas," Evelyn said. He turned back. She was looking at him with that steady, reading look she had. "You went somewhere just now." "Just watching the slope," he said. She let it go. That was something he was learning about her. She let things go when she needed to and picked them back up when she didn't. There was a precision to it that wasn't coldness, more like someone who'd learned to spend their energy carefully because they'd found out the hard way how much things cost. They moved on. By late afternoon, they'd covered roughly 14 miles, which was better than Silas had expected. Morrison Gap was still a day and a half away, but Pete Crab's farm was close enough now that they might reach it before full dark if nothing went sideways. He pushed the pace slightly, and nobody argued. The thing that went sideways didn't happen on the trail. It happened when they came down off the ridge onto the lower access road. a short, unavoidable stretch of open ground that Silas had planned to cross quickly, and found fresh horse tracks in the mud at the road's edge. 3 horses, moving south, recent enough that the edges of the prints hadn't dried yet. He stopped, crouched down, looked at the prints. "How recent?" Evelyn asked behind him, her voice low. 2 hours, maybe less. He looked at the direction, south toward town. Not coming up the mountain, going away from it. He stood and looked both directions along the road. Empty. Could be nothing. Could be, she agreed, in a tone that said they both knew it probably wasn't. He made a decision quickly. Going back up wasn't an option. Too much ground lost. Going forward on the road was too exposed. He looked at the timber on the north side of the road, thicker here, running roughly parallel to the road for about half a mile before the terrain changed. "Through the trees," he said. "Stay close." They crossed the open ground fast, all 3 of them, and got into the timber, and Silas moved parallel to the road at enough distance that they couldn't be seen from it. It added time, and the footing was rough, and Noah tripped twice on hidden roots, the second time badly enough that Silas caught him by the arm before he went fully down. The boy looked up at him with those serious dark eyes and said nothing, just found his feet and kept moving. Silas held onto that arm another 5 seconds before letting go. They cleared the exposed section and came back toward the road where the tree line curved close, and Silas held them up at the edge of the timber and looked. The road was empty both directions as far as he could see. 3 horses, south, gone. He let out a slow breath. "We're all right," he said. "For now," Evelyn said. Not pessimism, just accuracy. They reached Pete Crab's farm 40 minutes before dark. What? Pete Crab was sitting on his porch with a rifle across his knees when they came up the track to his house, which could have been alarming except that he appeared to be asleep. He was a large man, gone to beef in old age, with a white beard that hadn't been introduced to scissors in some time, and hands that looked like they'd been borrowed from someone bigger. He opened one eye when they were 10 feet from the porch. "Boone," he said. "Pete," Silas said. Pete looked at Evelyn, looked at Noah, looked back at Silas with the one open eye. "You got people with you." "I do." Pete appeared to consider this at length. He opened the other eye. "Anyone coming after your people?" "Possibly." Pete stood up, joints cracking in a sequence that suggested they disagreed with this decision. "Barn's open. There's a side room with a door that latches from the inside. Hay's dry." He looked at Noah directly. "You eat?" Noah looked at Evelyn. She nodded slightly. "We had something earlier," he said politely. "That's not what I asked," Pete said. He went inside without further ceremony and came back 2 minutes later with a pot of something that smelled like it had been on the stove since morning and a half a loaf of bread that was 2 days old but hadn't gone wrong yet. He handed it to Silas without a word and went back inside and closed the door. Noah looked at the pot, looked at Silas. "Is he always like that?" "Pretty much," Silas said. "I think I like him," Noah said. The barn's side room was small and smelled like old wood and hay dust, and the particular animal warmth that barns hold even in cold weather. There was a lantern, which Silas kept turned low, and enough loose hay that Noah was asleep within 20 minutes of finishing the stew, his breathing going slow and deep in the way that children's breathing does when they're finally, genuinely safe enough to let go. Evelyn sat with her back against the wall beside him for a while, watching him sleep. Then she said quietly, "He hasn't slept like that in months." Silas was sitting across the small room, back against the door, listening to the farm settle around them. "You should sleep too." "I will." She didn't move. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why didn't you have a name for your horse?" It was not the question he'd expected. He thought about it. "Never got around to it. She doesn't seem to care." "What was your daughter like?" Evelyn said. She asked it carefully, like she was aware she might be stepping on something that hadn't healed right. Silas was quiet for a moment. This was the kind of question he'd been avoiding for 3 years because answering it required taking the thing he'd sealed up and opening it even briefly, and he wasn't always sure he could seal it back. But here in this dim barn, with the sound of the boy breathing and the smell of old wood around them, it felt different, less dangerous somehow. "Stubborn," he said. She was 4 when she died, and she was already the most stubborn person I'd ever met. She'd decide something, and that was just the end of it. You could argue with her all day, and she'd look at you like you were speaking a language she didn't have to learn. He paused. She had Margaret's eyes. The same way of looking at you that made you feel like you were being read. He stopped. Evelyn waited. She called me Papasai, he said. She couldn't quite get all of Silas, Papasai. He said it once more, like testing the sound of it. I hadn't said that out loud before. Evelyn didn't say anything. She just sat with it, which was exactly the right thing to do. After a while, Silas said, "Get some sleep. We're moving before sunrise." She settled down beside Noah, and within a few minutes her breathing changed too. Silas sat with his back against the door and his ears on the farm and thought about nothing in particular, which was the closest he got to peace, and the lantern burned low, and outside the stars came out in the particular thick, indifferent abundance. They only managed this high above the rest of the world. Pete Crabbe was already up when Silas came out of the barn at 4:30 in the morning, standing at the edge of his property, looking south with his rifle in the crook of his arm. He didn't look at Silas when he came up beside him. "Had a rider come past on the road around midnight," Pete said. Loud, clear, the way a half-deaf man talks because the volume he's used to is his own voice. Moving slow, like he was looking at something. Silas looked south. In the pre-dawn gray, the road was invisible, just the shape of the land. "Just one?" "One I could hear." Pete turned and looked at him now. He had the particular directness of old men who've decided they don't have enough time left to be indirect. "Boone, that woman in your barn, she's running from something that's got money behind it. The man on the road last night, he wasn't some hired hand. The way he moved, the way he stopped. I've been out here long enough to know the difference between a man who's following orders and a man who's good at what he does." Victor Sloan, Silas thought. Already this close. "We'll be gone before first light," Silas said. Pete nodded. "The freight wagon route cuts through the Miller property. Old Miller put a second track in 2 seasons ago when the main route flooded, comes out 3 miles north of where it used to. You know that?" "I didn't." "Know it now." Pete looked back south. 3 miles north puts you closer to the Gap approach without using the open valley floor. He paused. "I'm not getting involved." "I know. I'm just telling you about a road." "I appreciate it." Pete nodded again and went back toward his house. At the porch steps he stopped and said, without turning around, "The boy. He remind you of someone?" Silas didn't answer. "Thought so," Pete said, and went inside. "What?" They left the farm in full dark, heading northeast on the adjusted freight route that Pete had described. And by the time the light came up, they were far enough into the hill country that the open valley floor was behind them and the terrain was working in their favor. Broken ground, scattered timber, the kind of landscape that made it very difficult to move fast without making noise. Silas had moved his estimate of Sloane's position up considerably. If that was Sloane on the road last night, and he felt in his bones that it was, then Sloane had covered ground faster than Silas had calculated. Either he had better information about their direction than should have been possible, or he was simply that good at reading country and making correct guesses. He started thinking about the information problem more seriously. Evelyn had said she didn't know how Sloane found them at the last location so quickly. She'd been careful. She'd trusted very few people. But Sloane had found them anyway, which meant either the people she'd trusted weren't fully trustworthy, or Sloane was using a method she hadn't accounted for. He turned this over for 2 hours of walking without coming to a comfortable answer. Around mid-morning, they hit a problem. The freight track crossed a shallow river at a ford that was, according to Pete's description, passable without difficulty. What Pete hadn't known, or hadn't thought to mention, was that something upstream had changed the water flow in the last week. The ford was still shallow enough, but the current was faster than the ford markers assumed, and the bottom had been disturbed and was uneven. The horse could manage it. Evelyn could manage it. Noah, who was small and light, was going to have a more interesting time. They stood at the bank and looked at it. The crossing was maybe 30 feet wide. Fast, but not deep. Knee height on an adult, which meant waist height on Noah. "I can do it," Noah said immediately, reading the adult pause with the accuracy of a child who's had to compensate for being underestimated. "You probably can," Silas said, "and if you slip on that bottom and that current catches you, you'll go 20 yards downstream before I can get to you." Noah thought about this with visible seriousness. That's true, he admitted. I'll carry him across, Silas said to Evelyn. She looked at him, then she looked at Noah. That all right with you? Noah considered it. He was 7 and had his mother's pride in him, the kind that didn't bend easily. But he also had, clearly, her practicality. Okay, he said. Silas crouched down and the boy climbed onto his back and got his arms around Silas's neck. And they crossed the river with Silas picking each step carefully on the disturbed bottom, while Evelyn led the horse at an angle to cut the current. The water was cold enough to make his legs ache by the middle of the crossing, and the bottom shifted once under his right foot in a way that sent a jolt of alarm up through his spine. But he planted and held, and they reached the far bank without going down. He set Noah on solid ground, and the boy stepped off and immediately said, "Your heart was beating really fast." "Was it?" Silas said. "I could feel it." Noah looked up at him. "Were you scared?" "A little," Silas said, honestly. Noah thought about that. "That's okay," he said. "Mama says being scared and being brave are the same thing. Just one of them keeps moving." Silas looked at Evelyn, who was coming up from the bank with the horse, and trying very hard not to look like she'd just heard her son say that. "Your mother's right," Silas said. They moved on. The twist came at noon on the second day, 3 miles below the Morrison Gap approach, and it came in a form that Silas had not anticipated, which was how the worst ones always came. They were crossing a wide meadow, the last significant open ground before the timber closed in again for the final climb to the gap. When Silas heard the horse before he saw the rider. Just one horse. Coming from the north, from the direction they were heading, which made no tactical sense if it was Sloane's people coming after them. You didn't get ahead of your quarry and then ride openly toward them. He stopped the group at the meadow's edge, in the tree shadow. The rider came at a walk, single horse, rifle in the scabbard, hands visible. As the figure got closer, Silas's read of the situation shifted, piece by piece, into something he hadn't prepared himself for. The rider was not one of Edmund's hired men. He was a lean man in his 50s with a weathered face and a way of sitting a horse that spoke of long habit rather than affectation. He rode with the specific unhurried quality of someone who had already found what he was looking for and didn't need to hurry toward it anymore. Victor Sloane pulled his horse up at 30 yards and sat there. Silas put himself between Sloane and Evelyn without thinking about it. A movement that just happened, body making the calculation before the mind caught up. Sloane looked at him, looked at Evelyn, looked at Noah. His expression was not what Silas expected. He'd built a picture of Victor Sloane in his mind over the past 48 hours, part from what Evelyn had told him, part from the territory reputation, part from the evidence of a man who'd tracked them this far this fast. The picture had a certain hardness to it, a sealed quality, a man who did what he was paid to do and didn't look at the edges of it too closely. The man in front of him looked at the edges. There was something in Sloane's face that Silas couldn't immediately categorize. Not guilt exactly, not apology. Something harder to name. The expression of a man who has looked at something he can't unlook at and is deciding what to do about that. Sloane reached into his coat. Silas tensed. Evelyn made a sharp, small sound behind him. Sloane pulled out a folded document and held it up where they could see it. His other hand stayed visible and empty. "I'm not here for what I was hired for," he said. His voice was quiet for a man his size, precise in the way that people who choose their words care. "Take it as a kindness if you didn't shoot me before I get to explain that." The meadow was very still. Wind moved through the grass at Silas's feet. Somewhere above the tree line, a hawk was working in slow circles. "Talk," Silas said. Sloane looked at Evelyn over Silas's shoulder. "Mrs. Mercer, your husband was more thorough than Edmund knew. He kept a copy of the original Alderton deed, the anchor document, the one that starts the whole chain of forgeries. Edmund has the one he forged. He doesn't know a legitimate copy exists." Sloane looked down at the folded document in his hand. He did know that this one was in his private files, because he put it there for safekeeping. He did not know that I knew where his private files were. He paused. "I found it 3 days ago. I've been considering what to do with it since." Evelyn stepped around Silas. He reached out automatically to stop her. She moved past his arm without looking at it, closing the distance to Sloane's horse by half, standing in the open meadow with her spine straight and her face absolutely still. "Why?" she said. Sloane looked at her for a long moment. "Because I went to check the progress on the Harmon property 2 weeks ago. Edmund acquired it last spring. There was a family still living on it. They hadn't been told to leave yet. 3 children, younger than your boy. Something shifted in his face, a crack in the sealed quality that let something through briefly. The youngest one came out of the house and asked me if I was there to take their farm. She was 5 years old. She asked me like she already knew the answer. Silence. I've done difficult work in my life, Sloane said. I've done things I won't say were right, but I have never... He stopped, started again. I told Edmund the trail had gone cold, that you'd left the territory. He believed me because in 20 years I've never lied to him, so it didn't occur to him that I would start. Silas studied him. Every instinct he had was running the calculation. The years of reading terrain, of knowing when a thing was what it presented itself as, and when it was something else dressed up to look that way. Victor Sloane was either telling the truth, or he was the finest deception Silas had ever encountered. And in Silas's experience, the finer the deception, the more it cost someone to maintain it, and this man did not look like a man managing a performance. He looked like a man who'd made a decision that had cost him something and was still paying. That deed, Evelyn said. Let me see it. Sloane dismounted. He walked forward slowly, clearly aware of how this looked, keeping his hands readable the entire time. He held out the document. Evelyn took it, unfolded it. Her hands were steady. She read it for 30 seconds, and Silas watched her face, which went through several things in that 30 seconds. Recognition, verification, something that might have been the specific relief of a person whose gamble was paying off. This is Thomas's handwriting, she said. The annotations in the margin. This is his. She looked up at Sloane. He made a copy, and he put it somewhere Edmund would eventually find it, but not immediately. He was buying time. That's what I believe, Sloane said. He never told me. He was protecting you, Sloane said simply. If you didn't know it existed, you couldn't be made to tell anyone it existed. Evelyn looked at the document for a moment longer. Then she looked at Silas. Her eyes were bright but not wet. The brightness of someone who is holding themselves together by a specific and deliberate effort and succeeding. Silas turned back to Sloane. You said you told Edmund the trail went cold. How long before he starts to doubt that? He may already be doubting it, Sloane said. He's a careful man. He'll have sent others to check. My advantage is that nobody else knows this territory the way I do, so the others won't find you as fast. He paused. But they'll find you. Then we need to be in Denver before that happens, Silas said. Yes, Sloane said. Silas looked at him hard. And you? What do you want out of this? It was a fair question, and Sloane knew it and didn't pretend otherwise. I want to testify, he said. I know things about Edmund's operation that aren't in those documents. Names, dates, transactions. I've been part of his world for 20 years. I know where everything is buried, including things he thinks nobody else knows. He met Silas's eyes. I want to put him in front of a judge and watch it happen. That's what I want. The hawk above the tree line shifted its circles slightly east and moved out of sight. Silas looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. Between them passed the kind of communication that happens between people who have spent 48 intense hours reading each other's smallest signals. Not a full conversation, but the compressed version, the essential thing. She gave the slightest nod. Silas turned back to Sloane. Morrison Gap, he said. You know it? I know it. We go through tonight, all of us. Silas looked at the horse, at the lean, capable man standing beside it, at the document in Evelyn's hands. The shape of the journey had just changed. He didn't fully trust Sloane yet. Trust was something built over time, and they hadn't had any. But he trusted the look on the man's face when he talked about the 5-year-old girl, because that was not a look you manufactured. And he trusted Evelyn's nod. One thing, Silas said to Sloane. What's that? He looked at Noah, who had been standing very still at the tree line taking all of this in with those careful eyes. The boy doesn't go anywhere near the front of whatever happens in Denver. He's had enough of the front of things. Sloane looked at Noah. Something in the tracker's hard face changed briefly. A small shift, like a man who was remembering something and then deliberately putting it back where it lived. Agreed, he said. He went back to his horse. Silas stood in the meadow and looked north, toward Morrison Gap, toward Denver beyond it, toward whatever waited there. He didn't feel ready. He rarely felt ready for things. He'd learned that readiness was mostly a story. people told themselves, and that what actually got you through was just the willingness to go anyway. He looked at Evelyn, who was folding Thomas's document back into its careful folds, with the precise movements of someone handling something that cost everything. She looked up and caught him looking. "Ready?" she asked. "No," he said. "Me neither," she said. They walked north. Morrison Gap at night was a different animal than Morrison Gap in daylight. Silas had crossed it twice before, both times in good weather and reasonable light. And both times he'd come away with a specific respect for the north face descent. Narrow trail, loose shale in sections, a drop on the eastern edge that didn't announce itself until you were close enough to it that a wrong step was already a wrong step. In the dark, with a 7-year-old and a woman who hadn't slept properly in 7 months, and a man he'd known for approximately 4 hours, it was the kind of undertaking that a reasonable person would have postponed. They were not at this point in a position to be reasonable. Sloane led his horse and said very little. Silas had decided provisionally to let that be. The man was thinking, and thinking men who'd just turned against their employer needed space to do it without being poked at. Evelyn walked beside Silas. Noah was on the horse, not because he'd asked to be, but because Silas had simply put him up there at the base of the climb without making it a conversation, and the boy had the good sense to accept it. The climb took 2 hours. The top of the gap was cold in the way that high places are cold in fall. Not brutally, not yet, but with a specific intention, like a warning about what was coming in another few weeks. The wind at the crest cut sideways, and Noah hunched forward over the horse's neck and pulled his coat tighter, and didn't complain. The north face descent was worse than Silas remembered. The shale section was longer, and someone or something had disturbed it since his last crossing. A section of trail that should have been stable had slid partially, leaving a gap of maybe 8 feet where you were walking on loose material with nothing to anchor to. He crossed it first, testing each placement, then turned back. "Horse won't make this section," he said to Sloane. Sloane looked at it. "No," he agreed. "Noah, climb down." Silas held the horse while the boy slid off. "You're going to cross this part holding my hand, and you're not going to look down. You understand?" Noah looked at the gap. Then he looked at Silas. "What's at the bottom if you fall?" "Nothing good," Silas said. "So we won't fall." Noah nodded like this was a satisfactory answer and took Silas's hand. They crossed the shale section in small, careful steps. Silas placing each foot before shifting weight. Noah matching him almost perfectly, and they reached solid ground on the other side, and Silas let out a breath he hadn't entirely realized he was holding. Evelyn crossed next, alone, without assistance, and without being asked if she needed any. Sloane crossed last, and then between the 3 adults they coaxed the horse across with a combination of patience and stubbornness that took 20 minutes and tested everyone's nerves in a specific and unpleasant way. When the horse was across, Noah looked up at Silas and said, "That was bad." "It was," Silas agreed. "But we did it." "We did." The boy seemed satisfied and climbed back onto the horse without further commentary. Evelyn looked at Silas in the dark, not saying anything, just a look that acknowledged something between them. The particular accumulation of difficulty that becomes, at some point, a kind of bond whether you mean it to or not. He looked back at her and then looked north, down the descent, toward the flatter country and eventually Denver. 4 more miles to the valley floor, he said. Then we find somewhere to stop until dawn. They moved. The somewhere turned out to be a way station, a rough structure used by freighters and travelers, equipped with a wood stove and 4 walls and not much else, positioned at the point where the mountain track met the main freight road. It was empty when they arrived. Silas checked it before letting anyone inside, walking the perimeter, looking at the ground around it for recent sign. He found tracks from maybe a day ago, a single horse, nothing that alarmed him. He went inside. Sloane made the fire while Silas watered the horse at the trough outside. When he came back in, Evelyn had Noah settled in the corner on a bedroll from Sloane's pack, something the tracker had produced without comment, and which Silas had noted with the particular attention he gave to anything Sloane did. The gesture was right. That didn't mean the man was right. He was still carrying 20 years of working for Edmund Crowe, and you didn't run from that in a single afternoon in a meadow. But you had to start somewhere. Sloane was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall nearest the door, not the fire, and Silas understood this without needing it explained. The man wanted his back covered and his exit accessible, the same way Evelyn always sat facing the door. Old habits that kept you alive long enough to become habits in the first place. Silas sat at the room's single table. Evelyn sat across from him. "We need to talk about Denver," she said. "We need to talk about Denver," Silas agreed. She spread the documents on the table, all of them, the full collection she'd been carrying for 7 months. She'd kept them inside her coat, wrapped in oilcloth, and even after everything they'd been through, they were intact. Silas looked at them properly for the first time. There were more than he'd expected. Survey records, original land deeds with official recording seals, copies of what appeared to be the altered versions beside them, the differences marked in Thomas's careful handwriting in the margins. 3 sworn statements in different hands. A letter from a county clerk that, from what Silas could read of it, amounted to an admission of having accepted money to file fraudulent documents. Sloan spoke from his corner. "The Alderton deed I brought, that's the keystone. Every other forgery in Edmund's operation connects back to that original land acquisition. If you can prove that one was fraudulent, everything else unravels." "Jonathan Hale will understand that," Evelyn said. "Thomas trusted him because Hale took on the Brennan case 3 years ago. Railroad corruption. He went after it when everyone told him the railroad had too many friends in federal court." She paused. "He won." "I know Hale's name," Sloan said. "Edmund knows it too. He'll have people watching Hale's office." "I know," Evelyn said. "That's the part I haven't solved yet." Silence. The fire made its small sounds. Noah's breathing from the corner was deep and steady. Silas looked at the documents on the table. Then he looked at Sloan. "When Edmund finds out you've turned, what does he do?" Sloan considered this without apparent emotion, the way you consider a weather forecast for conditions you can't change. "He moves fast. He has enough political connection to create legal interference, injunctions, motions to suppress, procedural delays. He'll try to discredit everything before it gets in front of a judge." His eyes moved to Evelyn. "And he'll move against you directly. He's been restrained about it until now because creating a dead widow draws federal attention. He didn't want. But if he knows the documents are about to reach Hale, that calculation changes." "So we can't announce ourselves," Silas said. "No. And we can't use the front entrance of any building Hale operates out of. Not advisable." Silas sat with this. He was a surveyor. He thought in terms of routes and approaches and alternative paths. He thought about what it meant to need to arrive somewhere without being seen arriving, and about the specific geography of a city he knew moderately but not well, and about the kinds of people in a city who knew the back entrances and the side doors and the connections between buildings that didn't show on any official map. "Does Hale have a home separate from his office?" he asked Evelyn. She thought about it. "Thomas mentioned he lives on the north side of the city, near Larimer Street." "A home address is harder for Edmund to cover than a professional office," Silas said. "He'd need to watch it without looking like he's watching it. That takes more people and more time and more chance of someone noticing." "You want to go to his house," Evelyn said. "I want to consider going to his house," Silas corrected. "There's a difference." Sloan said, "It's better than the office. I'll tell you something else. Edmund has a man at the federal building on Blake Street, has for 2 years. Man named Greer, works as a clerk, passes along information. Anything filed formally gets seen by Edmund before it gets processed." He paused. "Hale would need to be warned about that." "One more thing he doesn't know," Evelyn said quietly, and the tone of it wasn't bitterness so much as a particular exhaustion, the tiredness of someone who has been discovering, one piece at a time, how completely they were surrounded. "It's actually useful," Silas said. "If Edmund has covered the formal channels, he's probably less focused on the informal ones. A private approach to Hale's home, done right, might land before Edmund even knows you're in the city." She looked at him. "And if it doesn't?" "Then we adjust," he said. Which was not a satisfying answer, and he knew it, but it was the only honest one. They talked for another hour, working through the approach. Sloan contributed the details that only someone inside Edmund's operation would know. The names of the men most likely to be posted in Denver, the signals they used, the areas of the city Edmund's network covered most heavily. Silas contributed the route logic. Evelyn contributed the knowledge of Hale himself, of what Thomas had told her, of the specific nature of the evidence and how it needed to be presented to be immediately actionable rather than merely interesting. It was, Silas thought, a strange council of three. A woman who'd spent 7 months running, a surveyor who'd spent 3 years hiding, a tracker who'd spent 20 years on the wrong side and had only just walked off it. None of them were the people you'd designed for this job if you had a choice, but choice had not been prominent in any of their recent histories. They reached Denver's outer edge the following afternoon, coming in from the northwest on a freight road that brought them into the city's less observed quarter. Warehouses, yards, the practical, unglamorous infrastructure that cities run on and don't talk about. Sloan knew a stable where the owner didn't ask names, and they left the horse there. From that point, they were on foot in a city, which changed everything about how they moved. Silas had been in Denver a handful of times for work. He knew it well enough to navigate, not well enough to be invisible. Sloan was more familiar with it, but Sloan's face was now a liability. If Edmund had people here, some of them would know Sloan by sight. They split up for 3 blocks, agreeing to meet at a particular corner near the northern residential streets. Silas took Noah. Evelyn and Sloan moved separately. It was a practical arrangement that nobody was entirely comfortable with, and nobody said so. Walking through a city with Noah beside him was something Silas had not anticipated feeling anything about. But the boy walked close, not holding his hand now, too old for that on a public street, but close enough that their arms brushed occasionally. And Silas found himself scanning the faces around them with a specific alertness that had a different quality than his usual alertness. More urgent, more personal. He thought about what Sloan had said about the 5-year-old girl asking if he was there to take their farm. He thought about what it did to a person, being asked that by a child. He thought about what it had apparently done to Sloan, which was to break something open that 20 years of careful sealing hadn't been able to keep shut. I thought about Noah saying being scared and being brave are the same thing, just one of them keeps moving. He kept moving. They reached the corner. Evelyn arrived 30 seconds later. Sloan arrived 90 seconds after that, from a different direction, and his face when he reached them told Silas immediately that something had changed. "We have a problem," Sloan said, low. "What kind?" Silas said. "I saw a man I know on 5th Street, works for Edmund, name's Carver. He's good, and he's positioned where he's positioned on purpose. He's watching the Larimer Street corridor." Sloan kept his voice flat, but his eyes were moving, checking the street around them with the professional habit of someone who'd been reading environments for danger his entire adult life. "He didn't see me, but it means Edmund's already covering the north residential approach." "How many would he have in position?" Evelyn asked. "In Denver, with advance notice? Could be 6, could be 10. Sloan paused. "He knows you're heading here. He might not know you're already here, but he knows this is the destination." Silas looked at the street around them. A city was both better and worse than open country. Better because there were more places to disappear. Worse because the places you couldn't go were controlled in ways that the wilderness didn't duplicate. Edmund's network in Denver was the part of this problem that open country and back trails couldn't solve. "What's between us and Hale's house right now?" he asked Sloan. "Carver's position covers the most direct route. There are 2 other approaches that avoid it, but both of them take longer. And the longer we're in the city, the more chance someone spots one of us." "Is there a way to move Carver?" Silas said. Sloan looked at him. "Move him how?" "I don't mean hurt him," Silas said. "I mean distract him. Make him look somewhere else for long enough." Sloan was quiet for a moment, thinking. If someone reported to him that a woman matching Evelyn's description had been seen on the south side, sit near the train depot, say, he'd have to respond. He'd pull his focus south. Who reports it to him? Has to be someone he trusts, or someone credible enough that he can't afford to ignore it. Sloan paused again. "I could do it. I'm still, as far as Carver knows, working for Edmund. He has no reason to doubt me." "And if Edmund has already sent word that you've turned," Evelyn said, "then Carver pulls a gun instead of going south, and I'll have a different kind of problem." He said it without particular drama, like a man noting a risk he'd already accepted. "But Edmund doesn't know I've turned yet. He thinks I lost the trail. He's working from his own people in Denver, not from specific intelligence about me." Silas looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. "It's his choice," Silas said. "Not ours." Sloan looked at him with something that might have been, briefly, gratitude. It was the kind of look that came from someone who'd been treated for a long time like a tool and was still adjusting to being addressed like a person. "I'll meet you at Hale's address," he said. "Give me 30 minutes. He walked away. They watched him go. Noah said, from between them, "Is he going to be okay?" "I think so," Evelyn said. "He seems like someone who used to be a bad guy and is trying to be a different kind of guy now," Noah said, with the particular bluntness of a child who'd absorbed a lot of complicated adult behavior and was making sense of it in the only way children can, by saying out loud what adults walked around. Evelyn looked down at him. "That's a pretty good read." "Can people do that?" he asked. "Just decide to be different?" It was a kind of question that had a complicated answer and a simple answer, and Evelyn gave him the simple one because she was tired and it was also true. "Sometimes," she said, "if they actually mean it." Noah thought about this. "I think he means it," he said. "I think so too," Silas said. They waited. 28 minutes by Silas's count. Then they moved. Jonathan Hale answered his own door, which surprised Silas. He'd expected a servant, a gatekeeper, some layer of professional distance. Instead, the door opened, and there was a man of about 50 in shirt sleeves and spectacles, holding a glass of water, looking at the three people on his porch with the expression of someone who has been interrupted in the middle of something and is deciding whether to be annoyed about it. Then he saw Evelyn. Something in his face changed, not dramatically. The shift was small, a recalibration. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. "Mr. Hale," she said. "I'm sorry for coming to your home." "Don't apologize," he said, and stepped back from the door. "Come inside." The house was a working house. Books on every surface, papers stacked in the ordered but full way that people who work constantly accumulate. A desk visible through an open door with 3 lamps positioned around it. Hale moved them into the study and closed the door and looked at each of them in turn. "Thomas told me he was building something," Hale said, "before he died. He sent me a letter. He didn't say what exactly, said he was being careful, but he told me if his wife ever came to me, I should listen to her completely." Evelyn placed the documents on the desk. Hale looked at them for a long moment without touching them. Then he picked up the first one, carefully, the way a man picks up something he understands the weight of, and he began to read. He read for 45 minutes. Silas stood. Evelyn sat. Noah fell asleep in the chair in the corner because he was 7, and exhaustion eventually wins over even the most determined alertness. Hale read without speaking, turning pages slowly, setting each one down with the same careful deliberateness. Halfway through, he took off his spectacles, rubbed his eyes, put them back on, and kept reading. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for about 15 seconds. Then he said, "This is enough. This is more than enough." He said it quietly, the way you say something that matters when you're still absorbing that it's real. "How many people know you have this?" "Now, 3 of us, plus you, plus a man named Victor Sloan who should be here within the hour," Evelyn said. Sloan. Hale knew the name. His expression went carefully neutral in the way that a lawyer's expression goes carefully neutral when they're rapidly reassessing a situation. "You trust him?" "Enough," Silas said. Hale looked at him for the first time with the focused attention of a man who'd been processing a document avalanche and was now turning that same focus on a new element. "And you are?" "Silas Boone, surveyor. I got them here." "How much do you know about what's in these documents?" "Enough to testify about what I witnessed on the route," Silas said, "and enough to understand why Edmund Crowe has been spending considerable money to stop us." Hale nodded slowly. "He'll know you're here very soon if he doesn't already. I need to move on this tonight. Not through the federal building on Blake Street. Before you say it, I know about Greer." He said this with the flat certainty of a man who'd spent years learning which channels were clean and which ones weren't. "I have a federal judge I can reach directly. Out of the Blake Street system entirely. If I can get an emergency injunction tonight, I can freeze Edmund's assets and block him from moving against witnesses before he even knows the legal mechanism is in motion." "Tonight?" Evelyn said. "Judge Aldous Warren. He owes me nothing, and I owe him nothing, which is exactly why I trust him." Hale stood up. "Mrs. Mercer, I need you to write out a summary statement while I make a telephone contact. As much detail as you can, as quickly as you can. Mr. Boone, I need you to do the same. Focus on everything you witnessed directly from the point of first contact with Mrs. Mercer. Can you both do that in the next hour? Yes, Evelyn said. Yes, Silas said. Hale pulled paper from the desk drawer and set it in front of both of them and went out of the room. Evelyn looked at Silas across the desk. They were sitting opposite each other, the same way they'd sat at the table in his cabin 4 days ago when she'd told him about Edmund and Thomas and everything that had led to a woman walking into a saloon and asking a stranger for his bread. 4 days. He ran that through his head, and it came back wrong, like arithmetic that refuses to balance. 4 days could not contain everything that those 4 days contained. She picked up the pen and said, "Silas." "Yeah." "After this is over." She stopped, started again. "I don't know what happens after this is over." He didn't know what to say to that, so he said the true thing, which was, "Neither do I." He picked up his own pen. "Let's finish this first." She nodded, and they both started writing. Sloane arrived 40 minutes later with a cut above his eyebrow that he hadn't had when he left, and when Silas looked at it, Sloane said simply, "Carver figured it out faster than I expected," and sat down and asked for paper to write his own statement without further explanation. Silas got him the paper and looked at the cut, and Sloane said, "I've had worse," and Silas believed him. Hale came back into the room at 9:15 at night and said, "Judge Warren will see us at 10. He looked at the four of them, Evelyn, Silas, Sloane, and Noah, who'd woken up and was sitting very straight in his chair trying to look like someone who'd been awake the entire time. "All of you. He wants to see all of you." Edmund's lawyers arrived at Hale's door at 9:40. 2 of them with a legal notice that had been obtained from the county court, a procedural challenge to Evelyn's right to present the documents, based on a claim that they were property of the Crow estate, Thomas Mercer having died while employed by Crow, and any work product generated in that capacity belonging to the employer. It was a thin argument, and they all knew it. But thin arguments filed in the right place at the right time by the right lawyers could tie things up for months. Hale read the notice at the door. The lawyers stood on the porch. Hale said pleasantly, "Thank you, noted," and closed the door and said to the room, "We go out the back. Now." They went out the back. Noah pressed close to Silas's side as they moved through the dark behind Hale's house, into the alley, heading north toward the judge's residence. The boy's hand found Silas's without either of them doing it deliberately. One moment it wasn't there, and then it was, small and cold and tight, and Silas closed his hand around it without breaking stride. "You okay?" he said quietly. "My stomach feels funny," Noah said. "Mine too," Silas said. The boys seemed to find this reassuring. They kept moving through the dark city, all 5 of them, the documents inside Evelyn's coat where they'd been for 7 months. The truth that Thomas Mercer had spent his life building finally within reach of the place where it could do what he'd meant it to do. Silas thought about a man he'd never met, careful enough to make a copy and hide it where his enemy would find it, careful enough to write a letter to his wife that told her exactly what she needed to know, careful enough to send word to a federal attorney so that when a woman arrived on that attorney's doorstep, the door would open. Thomas Mercer had known he was running out of time, and he'd spent what time he had building the best road he could for the people who would come after him. Silas understood something about building careful things in the time you have. The alley opened onto a broader street, and Hale led them north without hesitation, and the city moved around them the way cities move at night, indifferent, busy with its own concerns, entirely unaware that something that mattered was passing through its streets. 4 days ago, Silas Boone had been sitting at a bar eating cold food and talking to no one. He held a boy's hand in the dark and walked toward whatever came next, and he did not feel ready, and he went anyway, because that was, it turned out, the only way any of this ever actually worked. Judge Aldous Warren lived in a house that looked exactly like you'd expect a federal judge to live in. Solid brick, serious windows, a front door that communicated through its architecture alone that the people who knocked on it had better have a good reason. Hale knocked on it at 10 past 10 at night without apparent hesitation, which told Silas something about the nature of their relationship. Regardless of what Hale had said about owing each other, nothing. The judge who answered was a compact man in his mid-60s with white hair and the kind of face that had done a great deal of listening over a long career and had learned to give very little away in return. He looked at the 5 people on his porch, Hale, Evelyn, Silas, Sloane with the drying cut above his eye, and Noah, who who was holding himself upright through what was clearly a considerable act of will, and he stepped back from the door without speaking and let them all in. He led them to a room that was half library, half office, and he sat behind a desk that had seen serious use, and he said to Hale, "You said documents." "More than documents," Hale said. "Witnesses." Warren looked at each of them in turn. His gaze stopped on Sloane the longest, not with hostility, but with the particular attention of a man who recognized a complicating factor when he saw one. "You're Sloane," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir," Sloane said. "You worked for Crow. For 20 years. And now you're here." "Yes, sir." Warren was quiet for a moment. "That's either the most useful thing that's happened in this case or a significant problem. I haven't decided which." He turned to Evelyn. "Mrs. Mercer, show me what you have." She put the documents on his desk. He read the way Hale had read. Carefully, completely, not rushing it, treating the material with the seriousness it demanded. But where Hale had read like a lawyer building a structure, Warren read like a judge measuring weight. I was asking himself not whether it was compelling, but whether it would hold, whether it would survive the specific assaults that a man with Edmund Crow's resources and legal team would bring against it. He read for an hour. Nobody spoke. Noah had given up the battle against sleep and was leaning against Silas's arm in the chair beside him, not quite fully out, but close. The way children get when their bodies have simply decided the matter regardless of what the mind wants. Silas sat very still so as not to disturb him. When Warren finished, he set down the last page and removed his own spectacles and cleaned them and put them back on, which Silas was beginning to understand was a thing that men of a certain professional seriousness did when they needed 30 seconds to finish thinking before they started talking. "The Alderton deed," Warren said, looking at Sloane. "You removed this from Crow's private files yourself." "I did." "And you're prepared to testify to that under oath, to the chain of custody, to how you knew where it was and how you accessed it." "I am." "Edmund's lawyers will attack your credibility front to back," Warren said. 20 years working for a man and then turning against him. They'll call it self-interest. They'll call it revenge. They'll suggest you're trying to negotiate immunity for your own conduct. "I know," Sloane said. "Are they wrong?" Sloane didn't flinch from it. "About the immunity, yes. I'm not asking for anything. About my own conduct." He paused, and something crossed his face that was neither performance nor apology, just the plain acknowledgement of a man who'd looked at his own ledger and found it wanting. "They're not wrong that I did things working for Edmund that I won't be able to defend in court. I know that. I'm not here because I think I come out of this clean. I'm here because it's the right thing to do, and I ran out of reasons not to." Warren looked at him for a long moment. "That's the most honest thing a witness has said to me in 20 years on the bench," he said. And it wasn't a compliment exactly, more an observation that honest things were rare enough to be notable. He turned to Silas. "And you?" "Silas Boone. I'm a surveyor. I have no connection to Edmund Crow's operation. I encountered Mrs. Mercer by chance and assisted her in reaching Denver. I can testify to everything I witnessed directly from that point, the men pursuing her, the nature of the pursuit, the conduct of the people involved." He paused. "I can also speak to the survey records in that stack. Several of those altered documents involve boundary descriptions. I can demonstrate specifically where the alterations were made and what they mean technically, because falsifying a survey record requires understanding how survey records work, and whoever did it understood it imperfectly." Warren looked at him sharply. "You can establish that the forgeries were made by someone with incomplete survey knowledge." "I can establish that they were not made by a licensed surveyor," Silas said, "which matters, because 2 of them carry a forged surveyor's seal." A brief silence. Hale looked at Silas with an expression that suggested this was information he hadn't fully processed yet. Warren wrote something on the pad in front of him. "Mrs. Mercer," Warren said, "Edmund's lawyers have already filed a procedural challenge at Hale's residence tonight. You know that." "We left before they could serve it properly," she said. "They'll file again in the morning. They'll argue the documents belong to the Crow estate, that your late husband generated them as work product in Crow's employ. It's a thin argument, but it creates delay, and delay is expensive." He looked at her steadily. "They will also attack you personally. Your character, your motives, your mental state after your husband's death. They will suggest you've been acting from grief and revenge rather than from a legitimate legal purpose. Are you prepared for that? Evelyn looked at him without blinking. Mr. Hale, she said, I've been running for 7 months with my son. I've slept in barns and crossed mountain passes in the dark and watched my husband's evidence come within a day of dying with us. I think I can manage a lawyer asking me unpleasant questions in a warm room. The corner of Warren's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one. Good, he said. He looked at all of them. I'm going to issue an emergency injunction tonight. It will freeze Edmund Crow's property transfers, restrict his ability to move financial assets, and place his key associates under a travel hold. It will also, and this is important, place all of you under federal protection from this moment forward. He looked at Sloane, including you. Sloane said nothing, just nodded once, a small, tight nod, the nod of a man who'd been operating without a net for so long that the concept of protection was something he had to relearn how to receive. The formal hearing will be in 3 days, Warren continued. That gives Edmund's lawyers time to respond, which they will do aggressively. It also gives Mr. Hale time to prepare the presentation of this evidence fully. He looked at the stack of documents. I want to be clear about something. What's in front of me tonight is, in my judgment, substantial. But I am one judge. What happens in that courtroom in 3 days will determine what comes after. I can protect you from interference. I cannot protect you from a bad day in court. We won't have a bad day in court, Hale said. It was the first time Silas had heard him sound like something other than a careful professional. There was something harder in it, something that had been built up over years of cases and outcomes, and the specific anger of watching powerful people use legal mechanisms as weapons against people who couldn't afford to fight back. I've been waiting for something like this for a long time. I intend to be very ready. Warren stood. Then go get ready, he said. I have an injunction to draft. They left the judge's house at 11:30 at night and stood on the quiet street outside, 5 people in the cold Denver dark who had managed to accomplish something that 2 days ago had seemed like it might not be possible. Noah, mostly asleep on his feet, leaned against his mother's side. She put her arm around him and looked at Silas and said, We did it. Not yet, he said. Close enough for tonight, she said. He thought about that. Decided she was right. Close enough for tonight, he agreed. The 3 days before the hearing were the strangest of Silas's recent life, which was saying something given the week that had preceded them. Hale installed them in a boarding house on the north side of the city, 2 rooms, clean and plain, run by a woman named Mrs. Farrow, who asked no questions and provided breakfast at 7 and supper at 6, and otherwise left them entirely alone. Federal protection meant 2 marshals outside, rotating in shifts, which took some getting used to. The visibility of it, the acknowledgement that they were people who needed protection, which sat differently on each of them. Silas found it faintly uncomfortable, like wearing someone else's coat. Evelyn treated it as a logistical fact. Noah thought the marshals were interesting and introduced himself to both of them within the first hour. Sloane stayed in the second room. He and Silas didn't talk much, but they developed a working understanding of each other that was based less on comfort than on mutual recognition. 2 people who'd spent long periods alone and had learned to read situations quickly and didn't need to fill space with words to communicate the essential things. Silas found he trusted Sloane more each day, not because Sloane did anything to engineer that trust, but precisely because he didn't. He just was what he was, consistently, without adjustment for audience. On the second day, Hale came to the boarding house with a younger attorney named Davis, who was going to assist with the presentation, and they went through the evidence with Evelyn for 6 hours. Silas sat in on the first part of it and then took Noah outside to walk because the boy had been cooped up for 2 days and was starting to exhibit the particular restless energy of a child whose body knows it needs to move even when circumstances have temporarily forgotten. They walked along the streets near the boarding house, not far, within the easy sight of the marshal who followed at a respectful distance. Noah walked with his hands in his pockets, looking at the city with the observant quietness that Silas had come to recognize as his natural state, not withdrawn, just watching, processing. Silas, the boy said, Yeah. After the court thing, what happens? To your mother and the case? To all of us, Noah said. Silas looked at the street ahead of them. It was a fair question and deserved a fair answer, which meant not making promises he didn't know he could keep. Your mother will be safe, he said. That's the main thing. Edmund won't be able to touch her. And the families who lost their land? If things go the way they should, the land gets restored to them. Noah thought about this. That's good. He was quiet for half a block. What about you? Silas looked at him. The boy was looking up at him with those dark eyes that were his mother's eyes, direct and without pretense. What about me? Are you going to go back to your cabin? I don't know yet, Silas said. Honest. Noah nodded slowly. He appeared to be working something out. The cabin's not bad, he said carefully, but it's far from everything. It is, Silas agreed. Mama likes the mountains, Noah said. He said it in the specific tone of a child delivering what he believes to be a relevant piece of information, without commentary on why he thinks it's relevant, leaving that part for the adult to manage. Silas looked at the street, felt something move in his chest, not the hurt this time, not the thing that reminded him of what was gone, but something that was oriented differently, facing the other direction. He didn't say anything about it. Not to Noah. Not yet. Let's go back, he said. Your mother's probably done with Hale for today. The morning of the hearing, Edmund Crowe arrived at the federal courthouse with 4 lawyers and a composure that Silas, watching from across the street, found instructive. The man was in his late 50s, heavier than Silas had constructed him in his imagination, with the kind of expensive stillness that came from a lifetime of being the most powerful person in whatever room he occupied. He didn't look at the people around him on the courthouse steps. He moved through them the way a stone sits in a stream, everything adjusting itself to him, not the other way around. Silas watched him and felt something that wasn't quite hatred and wasn't quite contempt, but lived in the neighborhood of both. It was the particular feeling you got looking at a man who'd taken things from people. Not their money, not their possessions, but the thing those things represented, the years of work and sacrifice, and the specific hope that you were building something that would last. Edmund Crowe had taken that from families who'd had nothing else to bank on. He'd taken it carefully, legally, through a mechanism designed to be impossible to fight. And he'd done it for 20 years because no one had ever assembled the right combination of evidence and will and luck to stop him. Silas turned and went back to where Evelyn was standing with Hale outside the side entrance. She looked at him. How does he look? Confident, Silas said. Good, she said. People who are confident make mistakes. He wasn't sure that was universally true, but he didn't argue it. They went inside. The federal courtroom was smaller than the idea of a federal courtroom, functional rather than imposing, wood benches, high windows, the smell of old paper and lemon oil. Warren was already on the bench when they came in, which meant nothing was starting casually. Silas sat where Hale directed, behind the plaintiff's table, and he watched the room fill. He watched Edmund's lead attorney, a man named Colquhoun, silver-haired and precise, with the practiced ease of someone who'd performed in courtrooms for decades and considered them his natural habitat, arrange his materials with small, deliberate movements that were almost theatrical in their calm. He watched Edmund himself sit at the defense table and fold his hands and look straight ahead at nothing in particular, like a man who'd decided to be bored and was committing to it. He watched Evelyn settle into the witness chair when Hale called her, and he watched her sit up straight with her hands in her lap and look at Colquhoun when he stood. And he thought about what she'd said to Warren. I think I can manage a lawyer asking me unpleasant questions in a warm room, and discovered that watching it happen was a different thing than hearing her say it. Colquhoun was good. Silas would give him that. He came at her sideways, not frontally, not attacking the evidence directly, but attacking the condition of the person presenting it. He asked about her mental state after Thomas's death. He asked about her financial situation. He asked, with the specific, careful tone of a man who knows exactly what he's doing with every syllable, whether she'd been under medical care in the period following her husband's passing. He framed every question so that the answer, whatever it was, suggested a grieving, unstable woman who had constructed a narrative rather than discovered a truth. Evelyn answered every question in the same measured tone. Not cold, that would have read as defensive. Not emotional, that would have confirmed what Colquhoun was implying. Something between them, grounded and specific, like someone describing what they'd seen out a window. She didn't elaborate beyond what was asked. She didn't reach for sympathy. She just kept putting one accurate fact after another into the record and letting them accumulate. The fourth time, Colquhoun implied, through careful phrasing, that her account might be colored by her feelings about her husband's death. She said, "My husband gathered this evidence. I carried it here. You're asking me whether my feelings about his death might have distorted my account of what these documents contain. I'd ask you to look at the documents themselves, Mr. Colquhoun. They say the same thing, whether I'm grieving or not." Silas heard someone in the gallery make a small, involuntary sound. Warren said nothing, but he wrote something on his pad. Hale on redirect was brief and surgical. He knew she'd handled it, and he didn't over-explain. He put the key documents in front of her one by one, and she identified each one clearly, explained what it showed, explained how it related to the others. When he was done, the picture in the record was complete enough that Colquhoun's theatrical calm at the defense table looked, for the first time, like something being worked at rather than something that came naturally. Silas testified next. He kept it to what he'd seen and what he knew professionally. The survey records were his most useful contribution, and he could see Colquhoun recalibrating as Silas walked through the technical analysis. The incomplete knowledge of survey conventions evident in the forgeries, the specific stamp that had been replicated imperfectly, the boundary descriptions that contradicted the physical terrain in ways that anyone who'd actually surveyed the land would have caught. Colquhoun cross-examined him on his professional credentials, on whether he could be certain the errors weren't made by a licensed surveyor having a bad day, on the possibility of innocent mistake versus deliberate fraud. Silas answered in the flat, specific language of a man who knew his field and didn't need to dress it up. He'd measured land for 15 years. He knew what deliberate alteration looked like. He said so without apology. When he stepped down, he looked at Edmund Crowe for the first time at close range. Edmund was looking back at him. The bored composure had developed a small crack in it. Nothing dramatic, nothing anyone might necessarily notice from the gallery. But Silas noticed it, the slight tightening around the eyes, the jaw set just a fraction more firmly than it had been at the opening. The look of a man who'd expected a manageable problem and was discovering that the problem had more dimensions than expected. Silas held the look for 2 seconds and then went back to his seat. Sloane was called in the afternoon. If Evelyn's testimony had been the architecture of the case and Silas's had been the technical foundation, Sloane's was the thing that made it human in a way that no document could. He'd been inside Edmund's operation for 20 years. He knew how it worked, not theoretically but practically. Who made what decisions, who carried them out, who got paid and in what form and through which channels. He named names. He provided dates. He described specific conversations he'd been present for, specific instructions he'd received, specific times he'd seen Edmund review the forged documents and give his approval. And then he described the 5-year-old girl. He didn't use it as theater. That was what made it land so hard. He just described it in the same straightforward voice he'd used for everything else. He'd gone to the Harmon property to assess it for Edmund's use. There was a family still on the land. A girl came out of the house and asked him if he was there to take their farm. He described what she looked like. He described what she sounded like. He described what he'd felt, which he named with the same directness he gave everything else. He said he'd felt ashamed and that it had been the first time in a long time he'd felt something that clearly, and that he'd gone home that night and understood that he'd been making himself not feel things for so long. He'd stopped noticing he was doing it, and that the girl's question had stopped working. The courtroom was very quiet. Colquhoun cross-examined him hard. He went after everything, the self-interest angle Warren had predicted, the 20 years of conduct, the question of why anyone should believe a man who'd spent 2 decades doing exactly what he was now testifying against. Sloane answered all of it without evasion and without excuse. He agreed with what was true. He corrected what was false. When Colquhoun suggested his testimony was motivated by a deal with the prosecution, Sloane looked at him and said, "I haven't asked for anything. You're welcome to verify that with Mr. Hale." Hale confirmed it on redirect. He'd offered Sloane nothing. Colquhoun sat down. Warren called a recess. In the hallway outside, Silas found Sloane standing alone at a window that looked out on a side street, hands in his pockets. He'd done something that cost him. You could see it in the set of his shoulders, the particular fatigue of someone who's been carrying a weight and has finally put it down, and is discovering that the putting down is its own kind of heavy. Silas stood beside him. Neither of them said anything for a while. "That thing about the girl," Silas said finally. "Yeah," Sloane said. "You didn't have to put that in." "I know." Sloane looked out the window. "It's why I'm here. Seemed like it should be in the record." Silas nodded. That was all. They went back in when the recess ended. Edmund's lawyers made their closing arguments with the specific professionalism of people being paid to do their best regardless of the facts. Colquhoun was skilled enough that even with what had been presented, he found angles, questions about chain of custody, about the circumstances under which documents had been transported and handled, about the credibility of a witness coalition that included a man who'd spent 20 years facilitating the very crimes being alleged. He built the case for reasonable doubt with the craftsmanship of a man who'd spent a career making reasonable doubt out of whatever material was available. Hale went last. He didn't perform. He didn't raise his voice. He stood at the front of the courtroom and went through the evidence piece by piece and connected each piece to every other piece and showed how they interlocked, how the alterations in the survey records matched the dates in Edmund's financial records, how the witness statements corresponded to the documentary evidence, how Sloane's testimony about internal conversations at Crow's operation matched specifics that only someone present could have known. He saved the Alderton deed for last. He put the original beside the forged version that had been in Edmund's possession for 6 years, and he put them both before the court, and he said, "Edmund Crow built his operation on the assumption that the original of this document had been destroyed. It had not been. Thomas Mercer knew what it would mean if it survived. He kept a copy hidden in the one place he could trust Edmund to eventually retrieve it, knowing that when that happened, someone would have it who understood what it was. That is not the action of a man who did not understand exactly what he had found. That is not the action of a man acting from grief or confusion or personal vendetta. That is the action of a man who knew he was running out of time and spent what time he had making sure that what he knew would outlast him." He paused. It did. Warren recessed to consider. The wait was 45 minutes. They sat in the hallway, all of them, Silas, Evelyn, Sloane, Noah, who had been brought in by Mrs. Farrow and one of the marshals, and who sat beside his mother with her hand in both of his, the same way she'd held his hand that first day in the saloon, the position reversed now. Silas sat on the other side of Noah. The boy leaned against him slightly, like he had in the chair at Warren's house, and Silas stayed still and let him. Evelyn looked at Silas over the top of Noah's head. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that was adequate to the moment. He looked back at her and then looked at the floor, and they all waited together. Warren's decision came in 3 parts and took 12 minutes to deliver. He granted the injunction permanently. He ordered all disputed properties frozen pending full federal review. He found the evidence presented sufficient to refer the matter for criminal prosecution of Edmund Crow and 14 named associates, including the county clerk who'd accepted payment to file the fraudulent documents, 2 state officials who'd provided cover for the operation, and the men who'd forged the survey seals. And then he said something that Silas hadn't expected. He said that the court wished to note, for the record, that the evidence in this case had been gathered under extraordinary circumstances and preserved through the actions of people who had significant personal risk and no formal authority and no guarantee of success. He said that the legal system depended, in cases like this one, on people willing to do what these people had done. Not because it was safe or easy or guaranteed to work, but because it was necessary. He said that without Mrs. Mercer's 7 months of perseverance, without the surveyor's technical expertise, without the tracker's decision to carry a document to the people who needed it rather than to the man who paid him, this evidence would not exist in this courtroom. He said that was worth noting. He closed his folder. He stood. He left. Edmund Crow was taken by federal marshals from the defendant's table. He didn't say anything. He walked with the same controlled composure he'd walked with all day, the composure of a man who'd decided that whatever happened, he wouldn't give anyone the satisfaction of watching it change him. Silas watched him go and felt not satisfaction exactly. Something quieter than that, more like the feeling when a long-held breath finally releases. Colquhoun gathered his papers. 2 of the other lawyers were already talking quietly, already in the mode of men calculating what came next professionally. None of them looked at Edmund as he was walked out. Silas looked at Evelyn. She was sitting very still, Noah's hand still in hers, looking at the place where Warren had been. Her face was doing several things at once: the relief that came from 7 months of running finally stopping, and the grief underneath it that the relief uncovered, because the reason she'd been running was Thomas, and Thomas wasn't there to see this. The two things lived in her face at the same time, not one then the other, but genuinely simultaneously, and it was the most human expression Silas had seen on anyone in years. He didn't say anything. He just sat beside her and let it be what it was. After a while, she said quietly, "He would have liked you." Silas thought about a man he'd never met, careful enough to make a copy, brave enough to look at something terrible and decide it couldn't be allowed to stand, precise enough to leave a trail that led here. "I think I would have liked him too," he said. The weeks that followed were not clean or simple. Nothing about justice is, despite the stories people tell about it. The federal investigation expanded. It pulled in people and records and financial accounts that even Hale hadn't fully anticipated, because Edmund's operation had roots that went further than the document showed: reaches into neighboring counties, connections to a land development company in 2 other territories, a network of cooperation between corrupt officials that had been built quietly over a decade and a half. Hale worked through it methodically, Davis beside him, calling on Silas and Sloan repeatedly for testimony and clarification and the specific technical knowledge that only people who'd been close to the thing possessed. The families came forward, one by one, then in groups, then in numbers that filled Hale's office on 3 separate occasions. The people who had lost land, who had signed documents they didn't fully understand, who had watched their farms and their futures absorbed into Edmund Crow's empire through mechanisms they couldn't name or fight. They came because they'd heard something had happened, because word traveled through the communities Edmund had preyed upon, because 7 months of one woman's refusal to stop had created a door that was finally open. Some of them got their land back within the month. Some took longer. The legal untangling of what Edmund had done was not simple, and the court system, even functioning correctly, moved at its own pace. But the first family to receive a formal restoration of their property title was a family named Harmon. Sloan found out the day it happened. He'd been staying in Denver, cooperating fully with the investigation, living in a rented room, and testifying when called and doing nothing else in particular. When Hale told him about the Harmons, he nodded and said very little. But later that day, Silas found him sitting on the front step of the boarding house in the cold afternoon air, not doing anything, just sitting with it. Silas sat down beside him. "The girl," Sloan said. Not a question. "Her family got their farm back," Silas said. Sloan nodded. His hands were clasped between his knees. He looked at the street. "I've been thinking about what comes after this for me," he said. "What do you land on?" "I don't know yet." He was quiet for a moment. "I've got nothing against me in a court of law." Hale made sure of that, whatever I said about not asking for anything. But I know what I did. 20 years of it. A man doesn't balance that out by doing the right thing once at the end. "No," Silas agreed. He didn't say, "but it matters," or "it's a start," or any of the things that would have been kind, but hollow. He just agreed, because Sloan was right, and Sloan knew he was right, and agreeing with what was true was more respectful than softening it. "What do you do with that?" Sloan said. It was a genuine question, the question of a man who didn't know the answer and wasn't pretending to. Silas thought about 3 years in a cabin, about the specific shape of grief when you don't let it move, when you seal it up and sit with it in the dark and call that surviving. "I don't know that you fix it," he said. "I think you just decide what to do next, and you do it, and you keep doing it, and eventually that becomes a different kind of person than the one you were. Not a fixed version of the old one. Something else." Sloan was quiet for a while. "That's not a very satisfying answer." "No," Silas said. "It isn't." They sat on the step together in the cold until the light started going, and then they went inside. Silas stayed in Denver for 6 weeks. He hadn't planned to stay that long. He'd planned vaguely to see the hearing through and then head back to the mountain, back to the cabin, back to the surveys that were waiting and the quiet that he'd constructed his life around. He kept not going. There was always another reason to stay, another day of testimony needed, another technical question about the survey records that only he could answer, another thing that required his presence. He knew, if he was honest, that the reasons were also named Evelyn and Noah. The thing between him and Evelyn didn't announce itself. It didn't have to. It had been building since the alley behind the Dusty Fork, Since the cabin and the map and the 4-day journey and the things said in the dark of Pete Crab's barn. It built the way things build between people who've been through something real together, not through romance exactly, not the kind of thing that comes with declarations, but through the accumulation of knowing someone fully in difficult conditions and finding out that what you see when everything is stripped down is something you want to keep seeing. She came and found him one evening on the boarding house porch, sitting with a survey map he'd been reviewing for a client, and she sat down beside him and didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, "I've been thinking about what comes next. What do you land on?" He used the same phrasing he'd used with Sloane, partly by accident and partly because the question was the same. "Noah needs a school," she said. "He's missed nearly a year. He's smart and he knows it, and he's starting to get bored, which for a child with his particular stubbornness is a dangerous state." She paused. "There are schools in Denver. There are also schools in the mountain towns." Silas looked at the map in his hands. It was a survey of the territory around his cabin. He'd pulled it out without fully examining why. "The cabin's 12 miles from the nearest town," he said. "That's too far for a school." "I know," she said. "There's a town called Ridgeline, about 4 miles from the cabin. Has a school, 2 teachers." He paused. "I know the terrain between the cabin and Ridgeline well enough to build a proper track. It's passable in most weather." She was looking at him. He was still looking at the map. "Silas," she said. He looked up. "I'm not asking you to fix anything," she said. "I'm not asking for a plan or a promise or anything that requires more certainty than either of us has right now. I'm just telling you that I know what it felt like before you, which was very alone, and I know what it feels like now." She held his gaze. "That's all I'm saying." He looked at her for a long moment. Margaret had been gone for 3 years, and she was not coming back, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. And he was not going to pretend he was the same man he'd been before she died, because he wasn't. Grief changes the shape of a person permanently, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But he was still a person, and the feeling in his chest when he looked at Evelyn Mercer was real, and he'd lived long enough to know that real things didn't come along as often as you assumed they would when you were young enough to take them for granted. "There's enough room in the cabin for 3, he said. "It'd need some work. Another room added on the east side, probably, and the roofs wanted attention for 2 seasons. He looked back at the map. "I'd need help with it. I'm a surveyor, not a carpenter." "Noah is surprisingly good with a hammer," she said. "He gets it from Thomas." "Then he can help with the roof," Silas said. She was quiet for a moment. When he looked at her again, her eyes were bright, and this time she didn't hold it back entirely, let a little of it through. And it was the first time he'd seen her do that. Not the contained brightness of someone holding themselves together, but the real kind. The kind that costs something to let out. "Okay," she said. Simple. Like the first thing she'd said to him, the thing about her son and the bread. Just a fact, stated plainly, without performance. "Okay," he said. "Oab." They left Denver in early November, the 4 of them, Silas, Evelyn, Noah, and Sloane, who drove the wagon as far as the junction, which was as far as his road went before it turned away from theirs in a different direction. At the junction, he pulled up the horses and they said what needed to be said, which wasn't much. Sloane shook Silas's hand, looked at Evelyn, looked at Noah. "You turned out pretty well," he said to the boy, who was sitting in the back with his feet hanging off the wagon bed. "You turned out okay too," Noah said, with the particular grace of a child who's been thinking carefully about the right thing to say and has landed on something true. Sloane looked at Noah for a moment with that cracked quality in his face, the place where the sealed thing had broken open, and didn't say anything else. He clicked the horses forward, and the wagon went north, and they watched it until it was small, and then they turned west toward the mountains. The track up to the cabin was exactly as Silas remembered it, except that seeing it now with other people beside him made it look different. Not the retreat he'd built it into in his memory, not the place at the end of the world where a man went when he'd run out of other places, but just a mountain trail on a clear November day, pine-scented and quiet, going up toward a piece of ground that had a cabin on it and could have other things built near it. Noah rode on the horse. He'd gotten better at riding in the weeks since the gap crossing, more comfortable, less rigid. He sat up on the animal's back with the particular confidence of someone who's mastered a thing recently enough that the mastery still feels good. Silas walked beside the horse. Evelyn walked on his other side. The trail was wide enough for two people, and they walked it close enough that their arms occasionally touched, and neither of them moved to create space. About halfway up, Noah said, without preamble, "Silas, are we going to be okay?" Silas considered the question. The real one, the one underneath the surface one. Not are we safe, which they were, but the larger thing, the shape of what came next, whether the arrangement they were heading toward was going to hold up against the ordinary difficulty of daily life. Once the extraordinary difficulty of running for your lives had been resolved, he didn't know. That was the honest answer. He didn't know if the roof repair would go well, or if Noah's school adjustment would be smooth, or if the town of Ridgeline would receive them easily, or if he himself had enough left in him to be what these two people needed alongside everything else. He didn't know any of that. What he knew was what he'd told Sloane. You decide what to do next, and you do it, and you keep doing it. "I think so," he said. "We're going to have to work at it. But yeah, I think so." Noah nodded like he'd evaluated this answer and found it adequate. "That's what Mama said," he said. "Your mama's usually right," Silas said. "I know," Noah said cheerfully, like this was established fact. "She knows it too. It's a little annoying sometimes." Evelyn, on Silas's other side, made a sound that was entirely, finally, a laugh. The real kind, the kind that came up without being invited, helpless and warm. It rang out on the mountain trail, and the horse's ears swiveled toward it, and a bird somewhere in the pines startled and flew. Silas had not heard her laugh before. Not once, in all of it. He looked at her. She was still smiling, shaking her head slightly at her son, with the particular exasperation of a mother who has just been accurately described by a 7-year-old. And she was beautiful in the way that people are beautiful when they're entirely themselves, when there's nothing between you and the real version of them, when the fear has finally stepped aside enough that what was underneath it all along can come through. He looked at the trail ahead of them and kept walking. There are things that break a person. There are also things, less dramatic, less advertised, arriving without fanfare in the middle of ordinary moments, that put a person back together. Not the same as before, not a restoration, something built new from what was left, which is different from restored and sometimes, if you can manage not to flinch from the difference, better. A piece of cold bread pushed across a bar, 2 sets of footsteps in an alley, a boy who carries his fear quietly and his courage loudly and calls you by your name like it matters that you have one. Silas Boone had stopped believing that his life had forward motion. He thought he'd used it up, spent it down to nothing, that what was left was just the maintenance of existing. He'd been wrong about that, as it turned out. He'd been wrong in the particular way that people are wrong when they've decided the story is over and someone shows up at the door and the story turns out to have more pages. The cabin came into view above them, low against the ridge, the same as he'd left it. He looked at it for a moment. Thought about the east wall where the new room would go. Thought about the roof and Noah's hammer. Thought about the track down to Ridgeline that he'd build in the spring when the ground softened. Thought about survey work in the valley below that would keep him close to home most seasons, which was a word, home, that had stopped feeling like anything specific and was starting to feel specific again. Noah slid off the horse before it had quite stopped and landed on his feet and looked up at the cabin. "It's smaller than I remembered," he said. "We'll fix that," Silas said. Noah looked at him. "Promise?" Silas held the boy's gaze. He thought about promises, the weight of them, the specific responsibility of making one to a child who'd already had enough things fail to hold. He didn't make them lightly. He didn't plan to start. "Yeah," he said. "Promise." Noah nodded, satisfied, and walked toward the cabin door like he already knew where it was, which he did because he'd been here before, because this was already in some not yet official way a place he knew. Evelyn stopped beside Silas. They stood together and looked at the cabin and the ridge above it and the sky that was doing something complicated with color as the afternoon light started its long drop toward evening. "It needs a lot of work," she said. "It does," he agreed. "Lucky you have help," she said. "Lucky," he said. He meant it entirely. They walked to the door and went inside, and Silas built a fire, and the cabin, which had been cold and quiet for 6 weeks, filled with warmth and with noise, and with the particular ordinary chaos of more than one life being lived in a space, and it felt nothing like it had felt before. It felt like something was beginning, and that after everything, after 3 years of dying slowly, and 4 days of running fast, and 6 weeks of watching justice take its difficult shape, that was enough. More than enough. It was the thing he hadn't known he was waiting for until he stopped waiting and started walking toward it. Outside, the mountain stood the same as it always had, indifferent and enormous and entirely unchanged. Inside the cabin, someone was laughing again. The fire caught. The light held. The story, which had started with a piece of bread and a question and a choice that a man almost didn't make, settled into something quieter and more durable than any of the miles that had led to it. It settled into a life.